When I came to Langley, and I'm going to make a few comments now on management, so to speak. I'm not against management. In fact, I took one of those tests and it said I'd be a very good manager, but then I decided, no, I don't think I want to do that. I want to keep close to the research. But anyway, when I first came here, it's good to have mentors, and one of the mentors I had was Jim Robinson. He worked with me on this Tiger team with the Viking GCMS box and so on. And Jim was always reluctant, or he was not reluctant, let's say, to supposedly explain things to managers. If there was something that really was important, it wouldn't matter who it was, whether it was the director of Langley on down. But he was trained at RPI as a real strong engineer, and he knew his stuff. And so he usually would, well, I guess he must have always been right, because he still managed to be around. But if you aren't like Jim, you could really get into trouble. But he always would go to the mat. It didn't matter who it was, and he was right. Well, and Jim told me one thing about management and technical capability. And of course you do. The best thing is if you have a technical manager. That's really great. But what he said is it's like a cantilever beam or like a diving board, that the engineers are out at the solid part that's fixed, and then the managers are up and down trying to satisfy the needs above them from Congress or whoever it is. So today it may be space, tomorrow it may be aeronautics, and up and down, but the engineers are real solid right here. So he said the farther you get out on that diving board, the more dangerous it is, and things change so much that your life, you're not in control of it. So that kind of gave me the feeling, you know, where you are in engineering, if you have a good solid basis, the farther out you go there, the more dangerous it is. Although it could be fun, but I decided to stick on that end of it. My supervisor also said one thing about opportunities on the outside at Langley. Oftentimes Langley people are very much in demand. They are some of the best people that are hired in, and they are given nice opportunities here, and so often there are opportunities on the outside that people will want to hire them out. So when situations like that came up, my supervisor would tell me, well, if you did take a position on the outside, of course once you're retired it's a whole different thing, because then you can take your retirement and then go and be contractor somewhere else. But suppose you're partway through your career and you get a wonderful opportunity on the outside. Well, you don't have your retirement there, so that isn't so attractive. And the other thing he said was that it's better to give than to receive, so to speak. That if you are at Langley, you are in control of what's happening with the various projects. If you're a contractor, you are looking towards Langley to see if they will support you in your ideas. So would you rather be writing proposals as a contractor to get Langley to support you, or would you rather be at Langley where you control and see all the different possibilities and then go with the winners? So that's a big advantage to be at Langley. And the third thing I mentioned earlier was about the mother hen idea, where you have a branch head that, fortunately, if they play the role of protecting you, it's more difficult in the modern days, but in the past I was very much protected by all of the above things. And my manager basically said, if you do your job well, then we'll let these other people see all the great things you're doing. The tendency is that if you do that prematurely, if you show, well, I'm a quarter of the way along the way, and then by the time it gets way up there, they think you've already done it. So then they say, let's do something else. So if the managers protect their people and let them accomplish something, and then when they got some big things to show, then they can show them. And that's the way my manager usually did things. I usually just do things because they're interesting from a research standpoint. So my supervisor one day said, Olaf, these new mini computers like the primes that we just got the prime in, don't you think that you could try to exploit that for structural calculations that we're using these huge computers that cost so much? And try to see if you can solve the biggest problem that is ever solved on our mainframe computers and see how they perform. I thought, yeah, that's kind of neat, because we have the machine here, we're more in control of it. The other ones were, you know, put in some key punch things. They weren't interactive, and it was more difficult to access things and use them. So I started and took some of the biggest problems I'd run on the big computer, put them on our little prime computer, and it took longer to solve things, but we usually got the answers back much faster because we more had control of it. We knew it was happening, and there weren't a whole bunch of other jobs competing and so on. And so I talked to one of my friends at NASA Goddard, Gary Jones, up there, and told him about it. He said, wow, can you send us your structural analysis code, and he'll try to do the same thing. They just got a VAX computer, which was similar to a prime. They followed primes. Primes were first, and then VAXes came next. So it turned, they were digital equipment, the VAXes. So he took some of the same problems and ran them on their VAX computer. And then my supervisor came back and said, wow, you guys got some really good results there. How about putting together a NASA technical report on that? So we decided, yeah, okay, we'll do that. So we took all the results and tables and charts and put them in a report. And we had the results from NASA Goddard too. And then once we had the report, there was another little factor in it too that came along, kind of related to management. Somebody said that you should never use color. It's just too expensive. NASA can't afford color. We're just a black and white organization. And so I decided, no, let's try. I rocked the boat and said, there's a brand new color terminal out there, and it can show you your stresses and strains and all the results so much better. All the red stuff is the bad stuff. That's the high stresses. And why don't we get one of those? So, and the cost was so cheap, so I had to run that through the whole system and finally got it through. And it was the first color terminal that came to Langley. And then in our document, we wanted to show the results in color also. And that was fighting another battle because people said, no, that's too expensive. You never use color. Of course, nowadays you look back and say, why would that ever be a problem? But back then, there were some of those hurdles we had to fight through. But anyway, we got our nice report and with color in it. And then the director wanted to see some real recent research. So he said, I want to see that stuff that is happening with the mini computers and how you can use them. So they invited me to take some of the charts and present them to our director. So I went over there. In the back of the room was the head of our computer center and some of the other people who I really haven't, I knew them, but I didn't think it was any problem. And when I went in, at first the director had just read something in the Washington Post about these new mini computers, and he said, yeah, I want to hear about this stuff. This sounds kind of far out and interesting. So I thought, that's a good sign. So I went on with my presentation, and I think he really liked the idea, and he saw we could save a lot of money if we were using these type of computers instead of these big behemoth machines. Well, when I left the meeting, the head of the computer center came up beside me and he said, Olaf, you just lost us our last big computer we were planning to buy. I said, what? I said, I didn't try to do anything. And then later on, I've heard from my supervisor that they were trying to discredit this technical report we'd written. And they had asked for some copies, and they were going through their own independent review, and they sent back a whole list of questions about this and so on. I thought, I've never seen that before, where somebody tries to write through, and once something it's been through an editorial committee and all this and published, that's it. But they were trying to withdraw all of this. So now this very seldom would ever happen at Langley. But that was bread and butter to them, because this was a threat to the empire, so to speak. Those outside of the moats and so on, I was outside there. So I felt kind of like Martin Luther. They were trying to take our thing and have us recant it all. Well, I just went through, and everything they said, I just made an explanation and said this is what it was and provided it back. They didn't want to accept that, so they brought it up to the director of electronics and said, and then two directors kind of fought. The director of structures was defending me, and the director of electronics trying to do the other way. They decided to reconvene the editorial committee, all the people that had reviewed it, and go over these topics. And the editorial committee backed us up, Gary Jones and myself and another author. Gary Jones was from Goddard. They backed us up 100% and said that anything that was said was null and void from the other camp. So that was one case where I kind of fell into something, but it was politics, definitely, because it was computers were very important, and the way you use computers, and this opened the floodgates. So then after that, many people were ordering new computers to have remotely around Langley. So now if you look at it, you know, they're all over the place. But if you are in the forefront, you can get in trouble that way. And so I realized that in retrospect. But I just innocently was doing what my supervisor suggested to do, and I didn't realize it would end up being a battle between two directorates. But there can be day-to-day things where there's a tendency for people just to say, oh, I don't think I can do that because of this rule or this regulation or whatever. And then a lot of these things are just kind of nebulous. You hear it from somebody, oh, you can't do that or something. Well, my supervisor instilled in me when I came, Bob Fulton, that if anything makes sense at NASA, you can do it. Anything. And because people are logical thinkers, and all through the organization, logical thinkers are going to respond if something makes a lot of sense. So when it came to, I'll give you several examples. One of them was that we have these forms that people sign off. And somebody signs off here, and then somebody signs here, here, and here. And maybe there's something that is to be done. One example was the Federal Express. We had a what would you call it? It was a display at Caltech that they were doing, and it was very visible to the people around the LA area. They're inviting people into these displays. And we had worked on the Caltech computer, some of the first ones, and got some really neat results in the Caltech computer. Well, unfortunately, I couldn't travel out there and present the stuff, and they said, well, they really want to have that exposed. So they said, we'll actually make the big chart, and we'll have somebody there that explains it. If you can send us a little script, and then you put the photographs and pictures of the results up there. So I prepared them, and it wasn't like today then where you could just email an attachment. Back then you had to have the charts, and actually the figures you had to FedEx them. Well, it turned out that I made my plans, and I knew at 3 o'clock, I guess, in the afternoon was the last FedEx that went out. And so about 1 o'clock, I had things ready to go. Then I saw you have to have various people to sign it, my branch head and his boss, the division chief, and even some other people there. And I had to get the deadline, otherwise the whole thing would be lost. So I guess the problem, it seems, was that they called an all-hands meeting that afternoon at 1 o'clock or something. So all the managers and everybody was over at this all-hands meeting, and I mean, I could try and go down the rows and get people to sign, but I thought that doesn't make sense. It's got NASA, this is great for NASA to have this stuff exposed out there. So I decided the only thing I can do, I'd seen other people had done something else. If like your division chief was out, somebody would sign for them. I think you're supposed to have signature authority, but anyway, I just put down that for my branch head, I said his signature by OOS, and then his boss by OOS, and then other people by OOS. And I took it over to the FedEx, and I said, I'm signing off for all these people. This is important to get out. And I did that. And then later, I thought I was kind of violating rules, but then later, Holloway, who was our director, had heard that I had done it, and he used it in an example of a whole room full of people and said, this is the kind of thing we need to change at Langley so that people can get things out without these tedious processes. So they changed the FedEx procedure, and then he actually named me and said, you know, people ought to do things like Storaasli. If it makes sense, do it and not be bound in the paperwork. Another example that I've heard a lot of times is you can't take a low-cost airline. It just, you know, NASA won't allow it. You have to take the high-price fare. And when I went to the fellowship over in Norway, there was only one U.S. airline. You're supposed to take a U.S. airline, and then you're supposed to, you know, whatever fare they offer. So Northwest Airlines was having some humongous fare. It was the only one that flew into Oslo. And so it just seemed like such a waste of money to spend all that. And I saw that this People's Express airline that had come up, it doesn't exist anymore, but they had flights to London for like $199 or something, and Northwest was $2,000 or something. So I went to the travel and said, I'd just like to take this People's Express. Flies from Norfolk up to New York and then over to London, and then from London I can take a little ferry boat, and next thing you know, I'm in Norway. And at first the travel court, no, you can't do that. You have to take this, you have to spend all this money. But then I just kept going higher and higher, and it wasn't too much above. They said, well, if you can show something's in the best interests of NASA, you can do it. And so that, I think, is the rule that a lot of people don't realize. So I have flown on AirTran numerous times. I heard in the cafeteria some person the other day that said there's no way you can take AirTran. Well, I've taken it, and we've been, so if you just go up a little bit and ask people, and you can show it's in the best interests of NASA, you can basically do anything. There are always these rules that people think that are there that make you so you can't do it. But I think that you should think of it the other way, that if something makes sense, you can always do it. And I'm willing to go with the mat, anybody on that. I figure, you know, otherwise you can just write to Jack Anderson or something and say that NASA's forcing me to do something that doesn't make sense, and, you know, then something will get changed. But I don't think you have to do that. All you have to do is just talk to somebody that eventually is a manager that makes sense, and things will work out.
Good.
So those are just a few tips on things that can be done that oftentimes people think can't be.